So, according to Peter Fever's book Armed Servants, the basic premise is that the civil military relationship can best be understood as a binary, a principal agent relationship, where the civilian leadership acts as the principal and the military leaders act as the agent. So, this comes from a microeconomic model of business, basically, where the goal of the principal is to ensure the agent acts in such a way as to ensure the goals of the principal. So how do you get your employees to do what you want to do in the face of a conflict of interest or asymmetric information? And this is often referred to as working versus shirking. The principal wants the agent to work, and the agent prefers to shirk. The principal ensures the working rather than shirking happens through monitoring. And the dilemma the principal faces is that there's a cost of monitoring, and it has to be weighed against the cost of the agent shirking. So is it worth the monitoring cost to ensure that the agent doesn't shirk to a certain degree? To review, the three models we've talked about so far, whether it's Huntington's model, Janowitz's model, or Fever's model, all agree in certain areas. For one, everyone agrees that the military should be apolitical. Two, they look at the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership as a binary one. That is, there's a distinct line between civilians and military members. That is, as to paraphrase Kipling, civilians are civilians and military is military, and ne'er the twain shall meet. Now, that's traditionally how it's been looked at, and we can look at sort of overlapping responsibilities, and Fever actually addresses this and says that even though there are these overlapping responsibilities, that does not mean that the line between the military and the civilian leadership is blurring. He writes that pushing the envelope does not erase the distinction between those who fight and those who get left behind. One might argue, however, that today, when you have civilian staffers at the Office of Secretary of Defense deploying fairly regularly to Iraq and Afghanistan while generals are testifying on Capitol Hill, the distinction perhaps has been a little bit blurred, in fact. And I think there's enough in common between the two groups that we might consider gaining insight by treating civilian principles as simply an extension of the military chain of command rather than being wholly separate from it. So consider for a second the perspective of a newly appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? It's got to feel somewhat odd for that individual to have worked all the way up to the pinnacle of the chain of command, only to find himself or herself, perhaps in the future, subordinate to a less experienced, less credible, and less qualified civilian supervisor, one might argue. The irony of that is that the first professional relationship that general or admiral probably had was at the beginning of his career, sort of a mirror image of what he has now. Back then, as a young lieutenant, he's the less experienced, less credible, less qualified, ensign or second lieutenant in charge of a staff sergeant or a chief petty officer who has significantly more experience, credibility, and qualifications than he does. And such relationships with a less experienced principal appointed over a more experienced agent are actually fairly common in the military. Now, what's perhaps most interesting about the traditional civil-military relationship literature is that it considers the relationship between civilian officials and military leaders to be endemic to the civil-military relationship, even though it has a tremendous commonality with the other senior subordinate relationships up and down the chain of command of the military. Now, this might be because so many of the scholars who have written about civil-military relations and civil-military issues have primarily experienced the relationship from the perspective of the civilian leader. They don't realize how similar it is to the experiences of those of their subordinates. For example, Peter Fever, who we'll talk to, he was appointed as a civilian leader, but sort of never did that from both sides. So the term mutiny on the ship of state, which describes a military coup, is a pretty good example of this. There's an age-old civil military question of how to arm the military well enough to defend the state without allowing it to use those arms against the state. It's very similar to a ship captain's concern about a mutiny. How do you make sure that your ship is, and your subordinates are well armed? They can take on another, any threat, but make sure those, those cannons, if you will, are not turned back on the ship itself. So the intramilitary concerns have evolved along with civil military concerns. Just as the fear of a coup was virtually faded from America's collective consciousness, as you can see from the fact that there are, First Amendment organizations, Second Amendment organizations, all these organizations that sort of take and make sure that we don't lose the amendment. No one really talks about the Third Amendment anymore, which the Quarterly of Soldiers. There's not really that innate collective consciousness consideration of a potential military coup the way there was at the founding of the nation. So just as the fear of the coup is faded from America's consciousness, so has, for the most part, the fear of a mutiny aboard naval vessels. The recent considerations are not really so much about that. Like civilian officials, however, today's military officers struggle with the question of how do they ensure their subordinates carry out their orders properly. They also struggle over how best to monitor their subordinates' performance, how to ensure compliance, how much autonomy to give their subordinates, and what should be delegated, how not to micromanage. So in the military, decentralization is the dominant doctrine of command and control. Seniors grant their subordinates significant autonomy since the latter have an awareness of the situation on the ground, and the professional supremacy view applies the same concept at a civil military level. So when the civil-military relationship is considered as an extension of the chain of command, I would say several trends become apparent. The first of these trends would be information asymmetry. So subordinates at all levels generally understand more about their own capabilities than their seniors do. Conversely, principals at all levels understand more about the big picture than the agents do. So once again, that means that the higher-ups understand what the mission is, and the folks on the ground understand what they're, what's actually going on the ground and what they're capable of doing. So that information asymmetry is at the very heart of many of the disagreements between principals and agents in the intra-military setting. The second trend I would consider is what is termed the Lake Wobegon effect. It's from Garrison Keillor. So due to information asymmetry and despite the sort of best intentions of militaries, members of the military, there still is frequent resistance to orders from above by subordinates. It's partially due to a psychological bias that's termed the Lake Wobegon effect, named in honor of Garrison Keillor's fictitious Minnesota town where all the children are above average. This bias causes individuals to overestimate their own intelligence, levels of effort, and general morality relative to others, especially in this case their seniors. So in a military setting, the Lake Wobegon effect probably causes subordinates to rationalize their disagreements with their seniors, and because the subordinates will overestimate their relative levels of knowledge compared to their seniors, and vice versa in terms of understanding what the overall mission is. So when disagreeing with seniors, subordinates tend to assume that their superiors their attitudes stem from career ambitions and political motivations, rather than conceding that the seniors have a greater awareness of the big picture. Conversely, when disagreeing with a subordinate, a senior might often assume that the subordinate's attitude stems from self-interest, laziness, rather than that subordinates, narrower comprehension of the big picture, or that principal's own understanding of the agent's capabilities. So the implication of this is that at all levels of the chain of command, seniors tend to see their subordinates as overly resistant or inflexible, while viewing their own, while the subordinates view the principals as overly compliant or accommodating, or perhaps political. So, whereas the principals have a greater understanding of the big picture, agents have a better comprehension of their own capabilities. And since both are factors, and because each actor definitely understands one factor better than the other, it's pretty much impossible to effectively determine whether principals or agents would be the more competent. However, if we assume that each of these actors will experience the Lake Wobegon effect, so each will have the inflated perception of their own capabilities and deflated perception of their subordinate or seniors' capabilities, we can predict that they'll all assume that they possess superior competence, term it competence. This is one reason that so many civilian defense officials take the civilian supremacy view, while so many military officers, likely prefer the professional or military supremacy view. Take McMaster, for example. Furthermore, although America's enemies have been unsuccessful to fight the United States militarily, they've become quite good and adept at taking actions that erode domestic political support during military conflicts. So, if it's true that modern warfare is waged in the American domestic political system rather than the battlefield, the military is no longer anywhere near the front lines and certainly has less awareness of that situation than those of the Pentagon do. So, given the assumption that the military lacks what Fever terms political competence, it's no surprise that the civilian supremacy view has become increasingly attractive to civilian leaders in recent years. Just say that again. Since modern warfare is often waged, not necessarily on the battlefield, but the center of gravity is the domestic political support, and the military doesn't always understand that as well as the civilian leaders do, that could be one reason why civilian leaders are increasingly doubtful of the military's political competence, the military's ability to understand what the big picture is, since they're actually, for the first time, nowhere near the center of gravity.